Okay, hello, Michael.
Good morning,
How are you?
Michelle. Okay.
How did you sleep?
All right. I
Okay.
usually do these days.
Okay, good. The reason I'm asking is last time at around the 15-minute mark in our last conversation, maybe the 17-minute mark, you gave me six magnificent yawns.
Oh my God.
You did. And, and there are two possibilities. Either you hadn't slept very well, or it was the content of my talk. And so now I'm asking just to remove any confounders. If
Um,
at the 16-minute mark,
it, it wasn't the nature of the talk,
okay.
but for the last year, I have had extreme sleep needs. I've been getting about 14 hours a day. So,
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was just making a joke. But all right, let's keep going here.
all right.
And okay, so for this lesson, what I want to do is situate a little bit this, Aristotelian-Thomistic tradition of philosophy that I've mentioned would be is the topic of this survey. So sort of situate it in history,
Uh-huh.
and then give a little bit of an outline of the course itself. Starting, when I give the outline of the course, I will also outline I will position natural philosophy among the other branches of philosophy in the Aristotelian tradition. So let's get started. This is
Okay.
a busy chart. It's from Wikipedia. It's about the schools of philosophy from antiquity, and it's busy, but um, I just want to situate for people in the audience who may not completely may not know this, or for whom it may not be all that clear. Here is Aristotle. It's about the middle of 4th century BC that we have Aristotle, and
That's a nice chart.
it is a nice chart, and it starts, of course, with Thales, the first philosopher in the Western canon. Um, and and of course, we know very little about the ancient philosophers, except, or much of what we know about them, we know from Aristotle or Plato or Socrates, who began to write, because the predecessors did not write much, or if they wrote anything, it was destroyed and so forth. But
Uh-huh.
so Aristotle is here, and but natural philosophy, or this systematic reflection on the world around us, on the cosmos, and on our place in it, does not start with Aristotle. In fact, it actually starts with Thales. I mean, it starts with philosophy. Philosophy starts with a reflection on using reason, the power of reason, about how does this all work? What is this all about? And and but our tradition, the Aristotelian-Thomistic, property starts, of course, with Aristotle. And then what I want to mention here is that even though Aristotle was very influential in his time, his influence really waned very quickly after he died. So, Theophrastus was a follower, but the school that he had established, the Lyceum, disappears very quickly. And then you have other schools of philosophy that become more prominent in antiquity, including the, Stoicism, various strands of skepticism, Epicureanism, and so forth. Those become reasonably dominant schools of philosophy. And of course, their preoccupation is more on the ethics of things, how to live a good life. But they do rely, they have certain assumptions about natural philosophy, about the world around us. And in fact, and they take those assumptions from a school of, what is called the pluralism. In particular, they take these assumptions from Democritus, who is now known as the father of atomism. So much of Stoicism and Epicureanism, took for granted that Democritus was correct, and so forth. So Aristotle, his thought and his writings essentially almost disappear completely. Um, uh, by some sort of random, historical event, they are recovered in Middle Antiquity. They are recovered. They are taken to Rome. Interest renews about Aristotle, And then in late antiquity, they get incorporated by a school, so-called the Neoplatonic, the Neoplatonic school. So these are followers of Plato, and Plato was, as people may know, Plato was Aristotle's teacher. So the Neoplatonists are followers of Plato, but they do incorporate some of certain Aristotelian writings and thoughts into their philosophy. So here I just want to highlight some of the main characters. We're going to be mainly dealing with, especially at the beginning of the course, so of course Aristotle. And Aristotle answers, so the natural philosophy of Aristotle answers two important pre-Socratic philosophers, Parmenides and Heraclitus, who are from actually the middle of the 6th century BC. And then Aristotle also answers some philosophies of, as I mentioned, Democritus, who was important, the atomism, Empedocles, who was also another pluralist, and we'll get into this later. And then, of course, Plato. So Aristotle distinguishes himself from his teacher, Plato, and so forth. So that just, I'm trying to highlight some of the characters. And then continuing the timeline here, if we have Aristotle in the middle of the 4th century BC, and then his writing is rediscovered in late antiquity by the Neoplatonists, and here I put Plotinus as an example. In late antiquity, a rediscovery of Aristotelian writing and thought. Aristotelian writing takes great prominence later on during the Islamic period. His writings were translated into Arabic. They were translated by Byzantine Christians into Arabic, and then Arabic philosophers took them and rehashed them and made a lot of commentaries about them. I put Averroes here as one prominent such example of a philosopher who commented a lot on Aristotle. And so Aristotelianism was alive and well in the Islamic world. And then those writings themselves get introduced back into, or not back, but they get introduced into the Latin West, in the 12th, 11th, 12th century by different ways. One is through Spain, and another one is directly from Byzantium back into the Latin West. And then they get discovered by the scholastics. And here I put Aquinas as being the most prominent exponent of Aristotelian philosophy in the Latin West. And then Aristotle becomes really quite dominant, that school of thought remains dominant through scholasticism, until, the beginning of the modern period. And here I put Galileo and Descartes as examples of philosophers who have rejected, who reject certain important foundational tenets of Aristotelianism. And that ushers the modern period with the scientific revolution. And Aristotelian thought essentially disappears almost completely and rapidly in the aftermath of the scientific revolution with Newton and the discoveries and Boyle and so forth. It almost completely disappears. But it remains sort of dormant and cultivated in certain, among certain religious schools of philosophy, notably in Italy. Around Naples, there's a center of people who continue the tradition of Aristotle, and in particular the tradition of Aquinas, because here we're talking about, it's in the Catholic world, and that gets a boost in the middle of the 19th century when the Pope Leo XIII, and I'm not clear on the details exactly, but he was concerned about the state of philosophy and theology in Catholic circles as being, perhaps incorrect and not, because by then much of theology and philosophy in the Catholic world had adopted a Cartesian perspective or a modern perspective. Whatever philosophy had how philosophy had evolved in the aftermath of Descartes, much of that was incorporated. And Leo XIII made a call for a recovery and of Thomistic philosophy and theology. And that gave an impetus for a rediscovery of Aquinas. And there's been, since then, kind of a renaissance in Aristotelian-Thomistic philosophy and theology, perhaps mostly theology, but philosophy as well, throughout the 20th and 21st century. So now here, what I have here, and it may not show up on the slide, maybe our little images are, here we go, if I move us here. So contemporary Aristotelian Thomism is what I put in the 20th, and that's where we are right now. So I just wanted to situate a little bit this natural philosophy in a historical context. I want to say a couple more things here. First is that, with Galileo and Descartes, then there's the divorce between philosophy and science, right? Whereas up until Galileo, it was all, what we understand to be science. So propositions that we would think of as being scientific were being made as if they were philosophical, and there was not, the distinction between the work of science and the work of philosophy was not clear in the mind of people before Galileo. It becomes, there's a divorce that happens between philosophy and science, and I think it's a necessary and a good thing, but at the same time, it's not a complete divorce, because up until now, at least in the mind of many, there's not a great distinction between what actually philosophy is supposed to do and what science is supposed to do when each of these disciplines make statement about the world. How do we, put them together or keep them separate, or do we keep them separate? And in many ways, I think right now, up until now, it seems that philosophy has taken second place, or is sort of second fiddle. Science provides really the most fundamental knowledge, and then the philosophers add to what science is telling us. This seems to be what is going on right now. And this is not the position of Aristotelian-Thomistic philosophy, where in fact it's probably the reverse, where you would need philosophy as being foundational, and then you need science to sort of not only bring precision, but actually maybe bring specificity to what philosophy says. What I'm saying here is abstract. It'll become clearer, I think, as we get into it. But I just wanted to make that point. And of course, philosophy in the modern period is no longer just one systematic philosophy of everything. It starts to splinter into many, many, many different schools of philosophy. And right now, it seems, kind of for many people, philosophy, I mean, you shrug your shoulders. You say, well, what kind of mumbo jumbo is this? It's really, it seems, it may seem completely unserious. And there is, I think, validity to that criticism, but at the same time, there have been important philosophical contribution in the modern period. I don't want to, deny that, that important contributions that were made outside of the Aristotelian-Thomistic tradition. But nevertheless, right now, it's, philosophy is sort of chaotic, and there is a revival or a renewed interest in Aristotelian philosophy outside of the Aristotelian-Thomistic tradition. Right, so outside of this strand that now was initiated in Catholic circles, by Leo XIII's proclamation, there is now in academia a renewed interest in contemporary philosophical departments about Aristotle, but they frequently go back to Aristotle. They might skip what the contribution of Aquinas. And they might skip, some of the clarifications that Aquinas has made to Aristotelian philosophy and so forth. And so, I don't want to devalue it, but I'm saying that it's not what comes out in this renewal of interest in Aristotelian philosophy is not always consonant with what is being taught and passed on in the Aristotelian-Thomistic tradition. And finally, on this slide, I mention here what's called the critique of science. The critique of science is what has emerged in the late 19th century in response to the new discoveries of science that have made it, that have created or highlighted certain philosophical problems. You know, up until then, mechanism was really the foundational philosophy of science. You know, you had Newton, and you had bodies in motion under subject to external forces, and that seemed very easy to comprehend. But of course, now we have relativity, and we have quantum theory, and we have these things, and so there's been a recognition that mechanism is not necessarily the end all be all. That there is a philosophical dimension that is important, and that goes, you know. So there's been a lot of work by philosophers there. So a new discipline has emerged called philosophy of science, which looks at the work of scientists and tries to grapple with it. But what we're doing here in natural philosophy is not, properly speaking, the philosophy of science. So the philosophy of science really is its own separate and interesting field of inquiry that looks at what scientists are doing and tries to make sense of it in a way. But for us, as I said, you know, in natural philosophy, we provide a foundational doctrine, if you will, that is properly philosophical, and with which we can interpret the work of science. Okay, so that's that slide. And so now I want to situate natural philosophy among other branches of Aristotelian philosophy. And so natural philosophy is really part of what is called speculative philosophy, regarding being as true. The word being is going to recur over and over in our talk, because in philosophy here, we're really interested in the question of what is, right? What is this? What is that? You know, what is something? And so what is being, you know, the question of being this. And when we're interested in being as such as, it's the branch called speculative philosophy, as opposed to practical philosophy, which is regarding being as good. So it's going to be clear in a second here, but being as good includes ethics as a branch of philosophy, and it includes aesthetics. So aesthetics and ethics are the two branches of philosophy, of practical philosophy, whereas speculative philosophy includes first the tools for acquiring knowledge, which is logic, okay? And then it includes the speculative philosophy regarding material being, which is natural philosophy proper. And so material being, natural philosophy, is interested, you know, in things that change. Material being meaning beings that change. So the world around us, the stones that fall, the stars that move, in you know, the man who becomes older as he ages, the acorn that becomes an oak tree, all these things that we sense, right? That we sense through our senses, and that seem to be changing. That's really the subject of natural philosophy. But you can ask questions about being in general, not just the things that change, you know, in the world around us, in the natural world, but you can have a philosophy about being in general, about ideas, for example, about beings that do not change. You know, maybe there might be some beings that remain constant and never change, and so forth. And that it has the label of metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is a loaded term. You know, people have sometimes recoil from the word metaphysics. It sounds like a mysterious term, metaphysics. It sounds a little bit occult. Its origin may be actually a lot more pedestrian. Aristotle wrote a book called Physics. He may not, the writings of Aristotle don't necessarily, the titles of the books are titles that were, are labels that were put subsequently, probably not by Aristotle. But there was the famous book of Aristotle called Physics, which is about natural philosophy. And then there's another book about more fundamental principles. And And that book was, in sequence, was placed after physics. And it was eventually, it adopted the term metaphysics because it was after the book of physics. And that's where the word metaphysics comes from, because it came after physics. And so it's about basic principles of being. So not just about being material beings that change, but about being in general. And so it includes, it provides really the very basis of philosophy. Metaphysics in the Aristotelian philosophical tradition is the most fundamental of the fields of inquiry. And in metaphysics, you can continue to subdivide this into epistemology regarding the nature of knowledge and truth, or ontology, being as such, or natural theology regarding maybe God as the principle of being, the most fundamental of all principles. So here, let me just at least mention for those in the audience who may be a little concerned about mentions of God in philosophy here, and maybe reluctant to engage in a course where God is mentioned. I want to say here that this is, if we do introduce the term of the notion of God, is going to remain at a very, very philosophical level, right? We're not introducing notions of God that are revealed in certain religious traditions like Christianity or Islam or Judaism. It's really the God of the philosophers. Because, as we will see, and we will touch on it briefly, but we will have to, when we talk about natural philosophy, we will touch on the idea of a first cause, that there is the necessity to invoke a first cause, and so an uncaused cause, and that is one way of identifying. God would be one way of identifying that uncaused cause. Okay, but the philosophy of regarding God, is called natural theology. We're not going to get into this in this course, of natural theology, but we will have to, from time to time, invoke, the first cause, or invoke God as we talk about, as we reason through our natural philosophy inquiry in natural philosophy. And here, if you think about it, so natural philosophy in a way is a subset of a more fundamental philosophy called metaphysics. And one might wonder, well, why not start here? If this is more fundamental, why not start with metaphysics to begin with? And one could, except that it's very abstract. And it's very abstract. And because we as human beings, we are sentient beings, and we know things through our senses and whatnot, it's easier, and it's been the tradition generally, although not always, but generally, to start with natural philosophy and get our feet wet that way. Because that's a lot more familiar to us. Okay, when we talk about natural philosophy, we're going to talk about the birds in the trees and the rain that's falling, and we're going to talk about things that are happening to our physical bodies and so forth. So we have that first-hand experience, and it's more familiar. And this is where we start. But we will have to bring in, here and there, and I will make that clear, principles that have been derived on a purely metaphysical reflection, from a purely metaphysical reflection, and we'll bring those into our natural philosophy. And so finally, so here, just to complete the thing, practical philosophy includes aesthetics and the philosophy of human acts, which is ethics and politics. The course outline, very broad outline, and I'm not sure, I can't tell you right now how many videos would be spent on each of these topics, but just to give you a sequence and where we're headed. So we start with the principles of change, because natural philosophy, again, is about material beings, and it's about beings that are subject to change. So we start with the principles of change, and we will talk about what is called accidental change versus substantial change. And then we'll talk about matter and form, very important fundamental principles of philosophy in Aristotelian thought, prime matter, substantial form. And then once we're comfortable that we've covered these topics well, we will go over other philosophical schools, whether they're ancient or modern, because this discussion here will bring up either objections, or will invite a contrast with a certain way of looking at the world that is more familiar to us, atomism being one of them. And as I mentioned earlier, atomism is both ancient and modern. It was ancient and it was resurrected during the modern period, and so forth. So we will contrast this way of thinking about the world with the other philosophical schools. And then we'll move on to talk about simple bodies, complex bodies, elements of nature. What are elements? What are, because we know that things that we see around are not very simple things, but they're made of different things. And how does that work? And from that, we will move to more general principles of causality. How do we understand cause and effect in nature, which is a very important thing that we want to reflect on, because our understanding of the world is, predicated on having a certain understanding of causes and effects. The question of nature: what is the nature of things? What does it mean for things that they have a certain nature? And then we'll talk about notions that are important in the physical sciences of quantity, place, and motion. We will try to understand those philosophically. And then we'll, once we are comfortable with these notions, again, we will challenge ourselves with certain, discoveries that have been made in the modern periods, that may call into question our philosophical principles. And we'll see how do they call into question these philosophical principles, or do they call them into question, or does our philosophy, can it still stand up to the challenge of modern science? And then once we're comfortable with that, then we'll go on and move to talk about life, because we distinguish living things from non-living things. We seem to be able to distinguish life from non-life, and philosophically, what's the definition of life? How do we reflect on this? And how do we reflect, once we've defined what life is, we can reflect on different kinds of life. There is vegetative life, and then there is sensitive life. There are, beings that seem to have knowledge. So we'll have to define what knowledge is philosophically, and define what knowledge is, and then talk about sensitive life and beings, animals that seem to have the capability of knowing things, right? And we'll talk about knowing sensitively through the external senses, the internal senses, what is called the appetites, and so forth. And I'm not going to expound on this at this point. We're going to close this video pretty soon. But then from then on, we move to rational life, which is really the life that we know of human beings, not necessarily, perhaps not necessarily exclusive to human beings, but certainly that involves human beings. And in rational life, I think I need to plug my, hold on, I'm going to plug my, yeah, there we go, my computer before it crashes. In rational life, we'll talk about the operation of the intellect, how human beings, know things. It's a specific kind of knowledge that human beings have that other sensitive life does not have. So the intellectual knowledge, and then the will, which is corresponds to the animal appetites. And so again, I will expound on this later on, but that will be essentially the end of the cursus. And then we can spend some time on different applications, philosophical applications, as we see fit. So I think that's it. Oh no, a little bit about sources. I view there are certain sources. It's not really extensive, and I'm talking here beyond the primary sources. The primary sources being the writings of Aristotle, okay, the complete writings of Aristotle, or the writings of Thomas Aquinas, and I will mention, what passages or what books and so forth as we go along are of interest in the primary sources. But for more contemporary literature, there's a little bit, not a whole lot in natural philosophy. I've taken a course from Michael Dodds, and he has 2 books that are available. They're pretty inexpensive online at lulu.com. One is called The Philosophy of Nature, and the second one is called Philosophical Anthropology. And I would recommend those as introductory material. Henry Coren had written books. They're out of print. Those books were used in college classes in the middle of the 20th century, or in the 1950s and 60s, to teach natural philosophy and philosophical anthropology. They're actually very good. They're out of print, unfortunately. although I think some of them are being reprinted, but they're expensive. But these are sources. And then for more fundamental, foundational metaphysical questions, there's actually more literature. I've used this book and the work of Norris Clark, The One and the Many, Contemporary Thomistic Metaphysics. I think it's quite good. There's a very good book by Edward Feser called Scholastic Metaphysics, published recently. I just want to give the audience at least some books to be able to refer to. But that's all that I have to say here. Michael, do you have any questions here, or?
Well, I can make a few comments now.
Okay.
If this would be a good
Yeah,
time.
that'd be great. Yeah.
First of all, the introductory survey positioning natural philosophy was helpful to me in a way that I wouldn't necessarily have expected. I had not appreciated how quickly Aristotle's thought had been lost in his own time.
Right.
That was a new idea to me. I was also wondering, when we get to the Middle Ages, the scientific revolution, the loss of Aristotelian thought there, it's tempting to connect that up with the triumph of Protestantism, except what doesn't fit for me there is that both Galileo and Descartes were Catholic.
Right. So you bring up a good point, and clearly my timeline is extremely simplistic.
Sure.
Because there was rejection, piecemeal rejection, or quibbles with Aristotelian thought from the get-go, and at the time of Aquinas. And there are people who were, departing from important Aristotelian principles early on but they still consider themselves scholastic, and in a way they still consider themselves Aristotelian.
Huh.
But for example, the nominalists, William of Ockham, rejected the idea of real universals, and that rejection, is a forerunner of empiricism.
Okay.
And so it begins, early on even within Catholic circles. Okay.
It's a very helpful response.
Right. So it begins quite early, and it goes on, and it plays a role in the Protestant Reformation. There's no question about it that these philosophical ideas and these conflicts do play a role in the schism that, or in the split from the Protestants from the Catholics. But you're right that both Aristotle, Descartes and Galileo were Catholic. And there was a rejection of Aristotelianism within Catholic circles very quickly after that. So many theologians embraced Descartes. Catholic theologians embraced Descartes, and they did so for without being challenged for at least 200 to 250 years, really until the middle of the 19th century, where Leo XIII explicitly said, this doesn't jibe with revealed truth, and therefore, get your act together, because, Catholics, at least, whether they succeed or not, but they say that there should be no conflict between philosophy and revealed truth and so forth. And so, so if there's a conflict, either we misinterpret revelation, or we reason poorly, and therefore we need to reconcile those things. And Cartesianism does conflict with certain fundamental Catholic notions about the human being, and the nature of the world, not just the human being, but sort of human cosmology. So Cartesianism. And frankly, up to now, within Catholic philosophy, there's a lot of there are many who find Aristotelian and Thomistic thought irrelevant and or disagree with it overtly. So, there's no such thing as an official Catholic philosophy.
Okay.
So philosophy is invited in the Catholic world, by the religious authority, is invited to develop and to expand itself naturally using the power of reason without using revealed truth, right? It used to be, and that's a long-standing tradition, because in the Middle Ages there was the saying, they were talking about the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And so the book of Scripture was a study of revealed truth, and then the book of nature was the reasoned study about the world around us. And they actually tried to keep those really quite separate. So in the Middle Ages, when they were philosophizing about nature, they were very careful not to introduce anything from revealed truth, right? They wanted to be very, very systematic about their reasoned approach. So the book of Scripture and the book of nature were kept separate, and there was it was thought to be valuable because it's a little bit of a check and balance, if you will, and then one could enrich the other. If you've made progress in philosophy, strictly speaking, without using any notions from revealed truth, you could gain insights that could help you with the interpretation of Scripture. Mm-hmm. And vice versa, if you studied Scripture, you might have insights that would bring up possibilities that you hadn't thought of, but might still be, in the realm of reason. So the two were kept separate. And then what you have with Galileo, you have the introduction of a certain understanding of the book of nature being mathematical, right? Where Galileo says, nature, I forgot the phrase, but he had a phrase where nature writes in the language of mathematics, or something to that effect.
Right.
So, but to go back to your comment, so as of today, there's no official Catholic philosophy, and so people are free to reject the Aristotelian-Thomistic philosophy, or to accept it or to embrace it, and still remain a Catholic in good standing.
Well, I wonder if I've been misled by some of my Catholic friends who identify as traditionalists and do the Latin Mass and all of that. And I would get the impression from them that there kind of was a fixed, true Catholic system of thought.
Right.
And maybe that's just their perspective.
Correct. It's their perspective. So now there are so in the official catechesis of the Catholic Church, you will have certain notions made explicit, and those notions are found in Aristotelian-Thomistic philosophy. For example, they will say man is a substantial unity of body and soul. Okay, you will have that in the Catechism of a Catholic Church, and that's in agreement with Aristotelian philosophy. So Aristotle introduced this idea of foundational unity. Aristotle himself was not Catholic, right? I think we can agree about that. And so that's in the Catechism. But in and of itself, it doesn't. So it certainly is. It's an agreement with that aspect of Aristotelianism. But that does not make Thomism necessarily the official. At the same time, I want to say that Thomistic philosophy has a pride of place in Catholic theology, and Thomistic theology itself has a pride of place. But it doesn't mean that it's not open to criticism and dissent, even among Catholic theologians. Because, again, Aquinas made contributions not just in philosophy; he made contributions in theology, extensively in both fields, and he used his Thomistic, his philosophy to bolster his theology and so forth, and whatnot. And so there are a lot of Thomistic notions from natural philosophy that are incorporated into, right now, the common articulation of Catholic doctrine. So I mentioned this one about the human being being a substantial unity of body and soul. But it doesn't mean that you have to accept the whole Aristotelian-Thomistic enchilada to be a Catholic, and many reject the whole enchilada. And in fact, for example, I'll tell you something. There's a question that is not made official Catholic doctrine to this day. The Catholic Church does not have a teaching on it. Is when does the human being become a natural, substantial unity of body and soul? When does the human soul enter the body, so to speak? So Aquinas, following Aristotle, thought that it was late in embryology, that it was not immediately, at the moment of conception, and that he based that on his own understanding of biology, given what he understood to be. And we'll get into this. Actually, it'll be a topic of that we will explore.
Okay.
So that creates tension among Catholics on the question of abortion and that sort of thing. And
right.
So there's no official position of the Catholic Church as to when the embryo becomes, a substantial unity of body and soul, which is kept separate from the question of is abortion okay? And the Catholic Church would say no. But it doesn't say no because it says that we know for sure that there's installment at the time of conception. So it brings up other reasons why it's not okay, and one of them is that it says that there's uncertainty and there's a possibility that it might be ensouled at the time of conception, and so forth. But anyway, but just to make the point that here's a teaching of Thomas Aquinas that roughens the feathers of many traditionalists, because they actually would have liked to be able to rely on Thomas to make a strong case against, sort of, let's say, very early abortion or that sort of thing, and they can't really use Thomas to do that.
That's very interesting. You're doing a terrific job of making me feel like my questions are worthwhile because your answers are fascinating. I'm appreciating this part very much.
Well, actually, I really value your questions because, again, I think members, since I don't have access to the audience, I suspect they will have similar questions. So I hope that's helpful to them as well.
Another funny thought I had when you displayed the slide where you emphasized the concept of being as fundamental to Thomistic philosophy. My association to that, the philosopher that I associate most closely with the concept of being is Heidegger.
Heidegger, correct.
I don't know him well enough to know whether he saw himself as taking Aristotle as a point of departure, or was that just coincidence?
So I don't know him either. I know that that's the case. I don't know him well. I'm pretty sure he was not Aristotelian in the same sense that I think of it. Because he's still modern, and therefore, as a philosopher, there's still a certain acceptance about what science tells us about the world and so forth, which is in conflict with Aristotelian philosophy. In its reductionist form, I need to add that. But there was, beginning with in the middle of with existentialism, with a renewal of interest in metaphysics that followed from the crisis, the critique of science. There was a sense in modern philosophy of the 20th century that we did need to grapple with the question of being, which up until then had thought to have been settled. That being really is a bunch of, that the mechanistic view of the world is what it is.
Right.
And therefore, we know what beings are. Beings are, collections of molecules and so forth and whatnot. And when these mechanistic notions were called into question, that reintroduced in philosophy a renewed interest in the question of being. And so Heidegger you're right, is one of them, but I'm not all that familiar with his philosophy to be able to contrast it with Aristotelian thoughts. But I may, in the course of the next few weeks, sort of peruse a few things, and then when the time comes, we can discuss this.
Okay, I think that would do me for now. So
all right, very good. Thank you.